Hundreds of students from Stellenbosch University have staged a protest against alleged racism and discrimination at the institution. The protest, dubbed a long walk, was aimed at confronting what they term systemic injustice. Dressed in black, marching students were demanding transformation and a social cohesion program at the university. This as the university is battling highly publicized incidents of racism. 19-year-old Babalo Ndwayana has laid criminal charges against fellow white student Theuns du Toit for urinating on his books and laptop. The embattled institution is also investigating another incident of alleged racism, this time towards a black female student, that happened during an event organized by the Faculty of Law. Right, let's talk more about this student life, particularly coaching that takes place in higher education institution. What does it entail? We'll also look at social inclusion. We're joined now by Doctor Disa Mogashana, who is a student life coach at the University of Cape Town. We welcome you and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Let's just start with the concept of life coaching at institutions of higher learning. What does it entail, so that as we continue further into the conversation, everybody at least grasps that?
Thank you, Bishop, and good evening to the viewers at home. Our prayers are with the people of KwaZulu-Natal. Life coaching, just briefly, it's like with any other activity that entails coaching. It's goal-orientated process. So in this case, when we're talking about student life coaching, my role as a coach would be to help students set their goals, but not only do that, it's a step further. It's a solution-focused process in which we then look at some of the challenges, factors that affect the achievement of those goals. And my role then is to help them overcome that so that they can achieve those goals. So yes, it's an interactive process, collaborative process between a coach and students. In South Africa, just to give a brief situation, life coaching in higher education, as we currently do it at atUCT, it's relatively new. It's well known in other countries, like in the United States and in New Zealand, for example. But for us, it's relatively new, and it's a very exciting space to be operating in. Lots of research going on at the moment to produce empirical evidence of the use of life coaching and how that can be fruitful in supporting students for success. So if you think about student support overall, you have academic support, which is lecturers supporting students based on content. On the other side, you have student wellness services who focus on, counseling students, psychotherapy. So life coaching positions itself somewhere in the middle, where we don't deal with clinical cases. So it's an intervention specifically for non-clinical cases to support students so that they can succeed in that which they set themselves up for.
So you say something that's relatively new. When was it introduced and what spurred on that introduction?
Well, it began first in my journey in 2018 when we piloted a study at CPUT. We've now moved on to UCT in chemical engineering, and the plan obviously is to expand next year into going to other universities in other provinces. It started small, of course, with just one cohort, but and what brought about it was really my research area. My focus is on student success and bringing in life coaching as a practice that I understand, that I was introduced to in my own journey to enable me to succeed in my PhD, and bringing about the outcomes of my PhD together with life coaching itself, the principles, and developing a coaching model that supports students. I mean, we understand coaching is out there, coaching is done. Students, it's not new that students are coached. I mean, it's an expensive practice. So privately, parents do pay for their students, but we understand that the challenges that we currently experience in higher education requires new solutions. So the whole intervention now is about bringing life coaching to a larger group of students who we know, based on the challenges that students experience in higher education, need this this coaching.
Perhaps let's zero in on
some of the challenges.
What are those challenges? Firstly, I'd imagine for some, it's the first time that they are away from home, their support structures, and as a young adult, I'd imagine it's also the first time you interface with your own personal responsibility and how you respond to situations.
Yeah, so just to give you a view of perhaps some of the challenges that are currently happening. We know that we are currently operating in COVID situation. The pandemic is still there. So what I'm finding, especially with the group that I've been working on as recent as yesterday, there's high anxiety levels among students, the high stress levels. There's adjustment to university. They've just gone through a shock of what it means to be a university student versus what it means to be a high school student. There's also poor time management. There's procrastination. There's overuse of social media. So students are pretty much trying to find themselves, to position themselves in the new space, learning online. So those are some of the very common challenges that we're currently experiencing. Over and above that, there's being away from home, like you've mentioned. There's, feelings of loneliness, alienation, trying to adjust to just what it means to be a university student. So a life coach then assists students in overcoming some of those challenges. Just to make an example, yesterday I had a preparing for an exam session with my students. And there I had to calm their anxieties down. We had to look at how do you reduce anxiety? How do you plan? How do you study? How do you enable yourself to succeed in what's going on? So it's more about that. It's more about providing support, guidance, mentoring, coaching, so that they can achieve their success.
Firstly, we know that racism is pervasive in our society. Whether people want to admit it or not, it is the lived experiences of non-blacks in this country, and nobody can tell us to shove it away and tell us to get over it. It is our lived daily experience. Secondly, universities are microcosms, or higher education institutions are microcosms of society. So as much as you've experienced that somewhere along the line in your life, the extent to which you do is different. How surprising is it for students to have to confront it in an environment that they would have thought as a safety pod of sorts? I know children can be cruel to each other, that racism knows no age, and unfortunately in some cases, or most cases, class as well. But I'm just trying to think what goes on through the mind of a young adult, a learner who's at university or institution of higher education, and they confront, we've been showing pictures of Stellenbosch University, obviously for a reason, because of an incident that took place there. Is it even more jarring when it happens under that type of situation?
Just pretty much to what you are talking about overall, including the Stellenbosch situation, is this idea of social inclusion, and what does it actually mean in a higher education institution. As you've mentioned, universities are a microcosm of what we see in society. And imagine you are a first year student, or a second year student, or a third year student, or any other point at the university. When you are faced with racism head on in the way that we have seen, it's a traumatic experience. It's traumatizing enough for people like myself who fight, of course, as a black academic, as a black female. Those challenges still come. But imagine as a student being away from home and finding yourself in a context that does that to you, where racism you face it head on. And it's traumatic. And I think this is why universities need to be very strong about the message that they are sending to their students and to society about these issues. because there's humanity involved, and racism can rear its ugly head to a point where it takes away other people's humanity, and I think that should be strongly discouraged.
The funny thing about racism as well is there's a contradictory manner in which it presents itself. It can either be in your face, like we've seen in that incident, or people completely ignore you. They don't see you, they don't hear you. How do you teach students to deal with that? How to cope with bullying, how to cope with racism, while still being able to focus on building your academic life, following your dreams?
So it's a very good question. It's tricky in that, for example, someone like myself as a coach, I will focus on students' strength, on encouraging them, on them being self-aware of who they are, and perhaps being aware of who you are and your humanity, and that you matter, and that you exist because you matter, and you are here for a reason. And being, empowering, on the one hand, one does their bit to empower the student to be resilient, to overcome, to look at some of these challenges as opportunities to rise above situations. But to be honest with you, I mean, there comes situations where systematically the action has to be stronger. It has to come. So we on the one hand, we help students, we enable them to face up to them and to rise above them, to not allow these kind of situations to break you down to a point where you end up leaving higher education. But it's tricky and it's difficult. We need a firmer stance from the universities, from the country as a whole. What are we saying? What are we saying? So we need a very firm stance on some of these issues so that, those of us who do the work on the other hand, our work doesn't go to vain, So yes.
I mean, we're seeing in these pictures of the protests that have taken place, students who seem united. You're seeing students of all walks of life, all races joining in that march to protest against discrimination, racism in institutions of higher learning. But I want to talk about the other forms that it takes place that is insidious, as you mentioned, systemic. I'm talking about the institutions of higher education themselves. They have exclusionary methods as well, and I'm sure there are countless of students of color who can tell you they've either been marked in a manner that belies that fact. Passes are given to students who are even better performing. So it's not as obvious, but it does take place and it targets students of color. How do you help them to get past that? Because sometimes you work hard, but you're not given a mark, even though allowances are made for students who are white or considered of a privileged background.
Very subtle ways. And it plays itself out in very subtle ways. Some of it is just like it's out there, it confronts you. But the very subtle ways in which it plays out are very difficult to identify. I think on the one hand, students have to be active citizens. They need to take it upon themselves. And I see that quite a lot at UCT, where students, there's collective action towards certain practices, towards certain behaviors, towards certain circumstances where they feel do not favor them. And you are right. A lot of the challenges that that students then confront have got to do with very subtle things in which they feel excluded. So yeah, I think collective action on the one hand, and at the same time, as individuals, they also need to focus on where they are heading and where they want to go. So right. Change takes time. Change requires active citizens, agents, agents of change, people who understand that they have agency and operationalizing that agency to bring about the change they wish to see. There's only so much that some of us can do, The rest has to be done by the Asians themselves, who are the students in this case.
Thank you so much. Really appreciated your time, your insights, and I'm sure the students appreciate your efforts as well. Dr. Disa Mogashana, who is a student life coach at the University of Cape Town. Now, we're going to take a quick break, and when we return, just keep this in mind. We are awaiting news out of KwaZulu-Natal. The Weather Service has advised on the status of the weather warning. So it was at level 4 yesterday. It's now increased to level 10. The intensity of the rain is expected to only subside tomorrow on Sunday, the 26th.